Morning, guys. I'm going to try something a little different today. Actually, what I'd like to do is kind of open up a conversation with you guys. I'm very curious what you think about this subject, and I hope to hear from you guys in the comments. While I talk, I'm going to restore a couple of beading planes that I've won in an auction on eBay. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what I'm doing on this restoration. I've made several videos restoring planes, so I mean, if you're only interested in seeing the restoration and you want those kind of details, you should go watch one of those other videos. But today, what I kind of wanted to talk about was something I saw on Facebook. I saw it a couple weeks ago, and a guy on some woodworking group made a post where he said something to the extent of, I use a CNC machine to make designs on the projects that I sell, and sometimes I get comments saying I'm not a real woodworker, or my projects aren't handmade, or you're not actually doing craft work, basically. And he was asking the group what they thought about it, and there was definitely some mixed answers. The overwhelming majority of people seemed to think, or replied, that a CNC machine is just another tool, and that it's still, the products you're making are still handmade. A CNC machine is different in some ways to, say, a hand plane, but it's the same in the sense that it's just another tool, and that if our ancestors who were using hand planes and hand saws and all this stuff, if they had access to a CNC machine, they would have also used it. So you shouldn't feel bad about using it. You are still a craftsman, you are still a woodworker, and your products are still handmade. There were also other people that said the complete opposite. They said, no, this takes more skill to do things by hand. It takes more time, it takes more patience. It's more like what you would consider to be a craft. I understand too, some people in the comments were saying, well, it does take a lot of skill to set up these machines. It's not like hand tool woodworking requires a lot of skill. We all know that. But there's also a lot of skill involved in the machine tool woodworking. It's just a different kind of skill. And I agree. I think there is a lot of skill involved in that. It is a different kind of skill. But does it being different in some way delegitimize what it is that you're saying you're making? Can you still call what you're making handmade? So I've been thinking about this, and I'm not sure how I feel, because there's a part of me that feels like there is definitely a distinction between the two types of woodworking. Let's just call it electric tool woodworking or machine tool woodworking versus hand tool woodworking. I think a big part of the problem is just in labeling. And another part of the problem is in the public's perception of what those labels mean. So what I mean by that is, if I go out here in the woods and I chop down a tree with an axe and I saw it up into lengths of lumber with a Roubo saw, and I plane all that down I dimension it by hand with hand planes and all the typical things that you've seen me doing on this channel. If I do that and let's say I make a box out of that wood, it's all handmade, it's all done with, I use traditional joinery, I use dovetails, I use all the stuff that we associate with traditional woodworking. If I go to sell that box, let's say I put that box in a booth at like a flea market, I could rightly label that box, something like, handmade by local craftsmen, or, something to that extent. But if somebody goes and buys, S4S wood from some big box retailer, and then they get it home and they dimension it with table saws and miter saws and band saws and all that kind of stuff. They never touch a hand saw at all. All they're doing is pushing a button to dimension the lumber to the size they need. And then, they might run it through a planer. They might have different attachment jigs for their router or whatever to cut the joinery. And at the end of the project, they've got the exact same box that the other woodworker made, but it's all made using machine tools. This person never touched a hand tool at all whatsoever. But they could still put that same box in the same flea market and label it, handmade by local craftsmen. Now, both those labels are accurate. Both these guys are woodworkers. So what is a woodworker? Well, a woodworker is somebody who uses tools to manipulate wood. So technically, both of these guys are woodworkers. Are they craftsmen? I mean, technically, yeah. I mean, in the eyes of public opinion, yeah, sure they are. But these two guys are well aware that what they're doing is two vastly different things. They know, the guy who made everything with machines knows that the guy who did everything by hand did something different. But that difference doesn't get passed on to the public. They're just paying for the product that they want at the cheapest price. And the cheapest price requires the machine tool work. That still leaves the question open of if you're using electric tools or machine tools, are you a woodworker? Are the things you're making handmade? So I don't think anybody is even questioning, whether somebody like me who is using hand tools, traditional antique hand tools, nobody's questioning whether or not the products I make are handmade or whether or not I'm a woodworker or any of that. The question really more is about machine tool guys. So that's kind of the questions that I'd like to hear the answers from you guys. What is a woodworker, and does that include people who use machines to do the job? I guess number 2 would be something like, are the products made with machines, are those products still handmade? And where do you draw the line? Because let's take a lathe as an example, because it's a good example. The motor itself is turning the piece of wood that I'm working, but I'm doing all the knife work. So is that handmade? And I'm sure there's a lot of nuance to this, and I'm sure there's some points that I haven't thought of. To me, I distinguish between the two by just calling myself, I call anybody who does wood with hand tools only and doesn't use electronic tools, I would call that person a traditional woodworker. So I'm pretty interested to hear from you guys and see what you guys think about the subject. The fact that you're subscribed to my channel as somebody who is a traditional woodworker, I assume the crowd here will be a little different from the crowd on the woodworking group on Facebook that I got this from initially. But I don't know. I'm curious to hear you guys' responses and see what you think about it. But I think that'll be about it for now. I hope to hear from you guys, and I will see you on the next video.